My name is Dr. Ben Payne and I work for East Coast Life at the Boundary. Tonight is our fourth and final virtual science talk. So far, we've had three great presentations, moving from the science that's being done to better understand the Hikurangi subduction zone and into the risk that this fault poses. So tonight we're joined by Dr. Julia Becker, who was with us last week. Julia is a social scientist based at the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University in Wellington. Welcome back, Julia. I'd also like to introduce Professor David Johnston, who is also based at the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University. To give a brief introduction of David's career has been extensive and he's researched many of the social and psychological aspects of disaster preparedness and response. Welcome, David. And from the previous talks, you'll also recognize and remember my lovely colleague, Natasha Blunden. Natasha is speaking as project leader of the Hikurangi Response Planning project. Tonight's conversation expands on last week's talk, and we look forward to hearing from these experts. Just before we get underway, who doesn't love a competition? And tonight we have a giveaway. As part of this talk, we have a grab bag up for grabs, sponsored by the Hikurangi Response Planning project. And the lucky winners will be able to add this bag to their preparedness provisions. The presentation is quite short this week, because the speakers wanted to really encourage questions and discussion. So on this basis, this is how we're going to give the prize away. It's pretty simple. Anyone who asks a question will go into the draw to win a grab bag. So get your thinking caps on and post lots of questions in the chat box, because that will increase your chances of winning this awesome bag, which is full of a first aid kit, torch, and those sort of various provisions that you need to be resilient. Just before I hand over to the speakers, just to reiterate, this is a free event, so please don't click on any links in the comments. And especially, please don't provide any personal details like credit cards and so on. So first off, I'm going to hand over to David.
Hello and good evening. Thank you for inviting me along to talk. What I really want to do is, can we get the next slide, please, Julia? Sorry. What I really want to do is just reflect on this period of time we've been in, and what we really want to talk about tonight is what have we learned from this experience that could lead us to inform us about what we might expect from an event on the Hikurangi margin. So I call it the 49 days of autumn, and for all of New Zealand and for the entire world at this stage, we are in a lived experience that none of us have experienced before, and has given us a lot of time to both respond to what has happened, but also reflect on how prepared we are for things in our lives that are difficult. And it is very hard times for all. But as a disaster researcher, the past can give us some ideas about what to do in this event and how things might pan out in the future, but also allows us to reflect on the other hazards we face and how we can prepare for other events that may hit or impact on our society, from nature, from human interactions and climate change and other things. So really want to reflect on the experience that we are going through, have been through. And I'm going to talk later on at the end about some of the recovery aspects, but I want to hand over to Julia now to share some of her thoughts about preparedness and some of the lessons from events and this event itself for future Hikurangi events. So Julia.
Thank you, David. Sorry, I was just changing the slide there. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about preparedness. That's one of the research areas that I'm quite interested in at the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University. So I'm interested in knowing what motivates people to become prepared for natural disasters, such as Hikurangi margin, subduction zone, earthquake and tsunami. But before I kind of go barreling down that line of thinking, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what preparedness is. So we can think about preparedness in lots of different ways, and more traditionally we've thought about survival items as being prepared. So this is things like, you know, having your water, your food, your medication, having a torch, having those types of supplies that we consider to be survival items that might help you survive during an event. And that's sort of a traditional type of preparedness that's talked about a lot, and that we encourage people to undertake. But there's also other types of preparedness as well. So we have structural preparedness. So for example, if your home is not structurally sound and you have a large earthquake, it could fall off its piles. You could be injured by a building collapsing. You could be injured by a bookcase falling on you, or your hot water tank rupturing. So those types of preparedness, so making sure your house is structurally sound and making sure that any loose items are secured, also a really important part of preparedness as well, particularly for earthquake and tsunami. And then a third type of preparedness is really around community preparedness. So that's where those social networks come into play that I talked about last week, that are really important. So knowing your neighbours, knowing the people in your community, having connections with things like your schools, with your local clubs, with your workplaces. All of those connections are going to help in a disaster, because you can help each other out when something happens, and you can kind of make use of those networks in terms of resilience. So all of these different types of preparedness are really important. And one of the other really important things to do that researchers often tell us as well is that you have to have a sustained type of preparedness. So you have to regularly keep your preparedness up. You have to make sure that you renew your water, that you make sure that your water's nice and fresh, because you don't want, 10-year-old water in your garage sitting there kind of all festering away. You want to make sure that all of those supplies are nice and fresh, that you check them regularly, maybe every few months, every year, and you keep that preparedness maintained. And it's also really important in terms of preparedness to have things like emergency plans, both for home and in the workplace, and you practice those emergency plans, and that includes drills as well. So drills like for the great shakeout earthquake drill, which many of you may have practiced, or tsunami evacuation drills. So practicing of those, having a plan and practicing those plans are really important. So preparedness is great. All of these things are really great. But what's really important to motivate that preparedness? Because a lot of us probably sit there and think, oh yeah, these are really great ideas. We should really get around to doing them. But a lot of us never actually do get around to doing them. So how do you motivate people to think about and to actually get prepared? So one of the things I wanted to talk about was awareness. An important part of the preparedness process is really just, in the first instance, being aware of what the hazard is, or what the risk is, or what the threat to you is. Because if you have no comprehension of what might impact you, then you're unlikely to be able to think about how to get prepared for that. And so I've got a picture there of the one of the maps that Caroline showed last week. Some of the ground shaking maps for a potential Hikurangi subduction zone scenario. And of course, as she mentioned, that's just one scenario. So being aware of what can kind of happen in these types of scenarios is really important, so that you kind of know what you need to prepare for. However, we know that just being aware of the hazard, or just being aware of the threat, isn't always going to necessarily get you to that preparedness stage as well. It's just kind of one tiny part of that. For example, we know that 98% of people in Wellington are aware of earthquakes. But when you look at the figures for the people who are fully prepared for that, so prepared at home and at work, we know that there's only about 25% fully prepared. Sometimes that number bumps up a little bit if you have an event. So for example, following the Kaikoura earthquake, it would have probably bumped up a little bit as people kind of became aware of the hazard and wanted to prepare more. But really, at any one time, only about a quarter of people are often fully prepared, even when they're aware of the hazard. Knowing what to do is also really important. So you might know that it is important to prepare, but knowing how to prepare is also another important part of the step. So you might kind of have a vague idea of what might be important to do, but you might not know, for example, how do you go about securing your foundations of your house? How do you go about securing your hot water cylinder? And some of those things might be a little bit trickier, and knowing how to do those things is important. So building up those skills is important. There's a lot of places that you can go to find some of the resources on how to prepare. For example, I've just got an image up there of the Get Ready website, which is the national website. But of course, for example, the East Coast Lab website's got some really good information about planning. The Earthquake Commission website has some great information about how to prepare for earthquakes, and local council and civil defence emergency management websites have great information as well. So some of that information can support knowing how to prepare for a disaster. And aligned with that is knowing how to respond. So, you know, if you do feel a long or strong earthquake, knowing that you do need to evacuate inland or to higher ground to get out of harm's way in case of a tsunami. One of the things I also wanted to highlight at this point was it's great if you've got money to prepare for things like, you know, survival items or to prepare your house structurally, but a lot of people don't have money to be able to do these things. So this is, I guess, where some of the community preparedness kind of needs to kind of kick into play. Who out there can't afford to do some of these things, and how can people who have more money support those people in terms of getting prepared for a disaster? So some of those community networks. So that's kind of something that's very much in the background, and that people at our centre do research on, trying to understand, you know, who can't prepare and how can we help those people. There are a number of different aspects that feed into the preparedness process as well. So people's beliefs are really important. People have to believe that preparing is going to make a difference during an event. So you can see I've got a quote up there: I can do something to deal with hazards, and as a result, my actions will improve my safety or lead to a better outcome. So you have to have some kind of a belief that by preparing, you're going to make a difference during an event. So we, I guess when we're talking to people and engaging with people on these issues, we're trying to build up these people's self-efficacy beliefs, and a belief that they can do it, they can prepare, and it is going to make a difference. You often hear this particular belief. People can be quite fatalistic about disasters, and I think I kind of mentioned it last week. Some disasters or some events can seem quite big and quite impossible to kind of do anything about. So people get quite fatalistic about them and think that they can't prepare, or that preparing isn't going to make a difference. So when we're talking to people, it's really important to talk about an event realistically, and to emphasize that actually taking some actions to prepare is going to make a difference to your outcome. You're going to be able to be safer during an event. You're going to be able to respond in the correct way. You might be going to save your life, and you might be able to reduce damage. So people's beliefs that they can do something is really important. Again, that kind of stops the fatalism. And as I mentioned previously, community networks, social capital, all of these things are really important. So getting people to work together to solve some of these problems, to identify some of the risks that they might have from threats like earthquake and tsunami, and then what they might be able to do about that, empowering people to do that, being able to share resources, and by talking to each other, people can share those beliefs that preparing can make a difference, some of those, and create a sort of a social norm around it. So yeah, so again, I guess this kind of is a little bit, talks a little bit more about what I was saying on the previous slide. So people's skills and resources are important to build up and helping them believe, understand, know that they can prepare and actually sort of create some solutions for solving problems. And some of that can be done in a setting where people participate together. And some of it kind of comes down to empowerment as well, so empowering people to create their own solutions. And I've got a couple of pictures up here. This is a reasonably known story. This is the Tsunami Blue Lines project that you can see here, that was initiated in Wellington in about 2010. And you'll see some of these blue lines if you drive around Aotearoa. You'll see some of these lines in lots of different towns now around Aotearoa, and you'll also see them overseas as well in places like the USA. And essentially what this project is, it was conceived by a community group who wanted to do something about tsunami risk in their patch in Wellington. And they came up with this idea of painting blue lines on the road so that people would know where they needed to evacuate to in the case of a tsunami threat. And so the emergency managers and the council thought this was a great idea. And so the council facilitated the painting of these lines on the roads. And it's become a really successful project that is now being rolled out worldwide as well. And it's a great way of raising awareness, and it's also a great way of people knowing, practicing for evacuation and knowing kind of where they need to evacuate to as well. Another study that we've been recently involved with that has really been involved with, has had all sorts of different elements in it. So it's had local emergency management and EC Lab support. It's had the community on Napier Hill involved. So it's been a sort of a bit of a kind of a community engagement project, I guess, looking at some of the issues around earthquake and tsunami evacuation and how to deal with that. So this is the Napier Hill evacuee study. And so it was decided after doing sort of a bit of modelling that it's approximately 15,000 people could evacuate from the lower lying areas of Napier up onto Napier Hill following an earthquake. And this was using the scenario that you've seen discussed previously in some of the other talks. And essentially, the question was, you know, once all these people go up onto the hill, up onto Napier Hill, what's going to happen? What do we do about it? You know, are they going to sit there for days, weeks? You know, how are we going to support those people? So we had some discussion groups with some of the residents and some of the workers that lived on Napier Hill to talk through how these evacuees might be supported following a large earthquake and tsunami. And so this process it's been really interesting. It sort of started a conversation in the community. It started some planning around how these people might be supported. And it's working towards kind of building community resilience to an actual problem that might actually occur during an event. So some of these scenarios, you can use these scenarios to do a whole lot of planning with and to work through some of these issues and problems and get buy-in from the community on solving these problems as well. And I think this is probably my last case study. And this really looks at a really cool project that we came across in Washington State. And this is on a community that has a similar threat, a similar earthquake and tsunami threat. It's a Costa school in Washington, USA. And basically they live in a really low-lying area and they could be hit by a tsunami at any time. And so what the principal of the school did was, along with, I guess, her supporters, was that they lobbied to build an evacuation tower in that town. It's essentially a gym, a school gym, and it has lots of stairs that go right up to the top. And so when there is a long or strong earthquake, the school children and the people from the community can come to this evacuation tower and go all the way to the top and be safe from the incoming waves. It wasn't an easy thing to build. We talked to Paula and she was a great advocate, and I think it went to vote about 2 or 3 times. in her local community to try and get support for it. But now it's been built, it's an amazing resource for the town, for the entire community who can come and use this particular vertical evacuation tower. You can actually read about some of the story on the East Coast Lab website as well, because there's a little story on it on the website. I just wanted to talk a bit about exercises and drills. I think I mentioned those previously. So exercises and drills are obviously a really important part of preparedness. I've got a couple of examples on the slide which show you the shakeout earthquake drill, which asks people to, on a certain day every year, it used to be every 3 years, but now it's every year, which is great, asks people to practice drop, cover and hold for when they feel an earthquake. So everybody practices it, everybody's used to the action, and so when a real earthquake comes along, people will be ready to drop, cover and hold just as they've practiced it. And we've done a little bit of research on that, and we found that doing these exercises actually does increase the rate of people doing it in a real event, so that's great news. And there's a picture on the other side. Similarly for tsunami evacuation, really important to practice those drills, practice where you're going to go, so that you can automatically know that, you know, if there's a tsunami threat, long or strong earthquake, that you can walk straight into the area that you need to go to, because you've already done it before, you've practiced it, you know where you're going, and you don't have to wait around. So one of the questions that we had as part of this talk was really, is COVID-19 preparedness transferable to a Hikurangi event? And the answer is, I guess, yes, a lot of it is, definitely. But then I think we also have to remember that every event is unique and specific, and there will be little differences that you will need to consider in terms of preparedness. So for example, in terms of COVID-19, there are definitely some similarities in pulling together preparedness items for an event. So for example, we were talking about the other day, you know, for COVID-19, there's been a lot of people getting hand sanitizer and getting together those types of medical supplies, preparing them and keeping them at home. Well, hand sanitizer will be just as useful in a different type of event, like a Hikurangi event, where you might not have good sanitation, or you know, you might have a disease outbreak, as we discussed in the impact section last week. Additionally, some of the internal personal skills that you build up for these types of events can be useful in the next event. So you see, I've got one of the New Zealand government's official advertisements, which says "Unite against COVID-19." They were wanting everybody to kind of pull together, work collectively, to, you know, stay at home and do the right thing for COVID-19. Well, those are similar types of skills that you can use in a future event. You know, working together, being part of the community. All of those things are really useful and transferable to different events. Some of those beliefs also that you pull together about things that you can do. I can do it. So those are all great. Obviously, there are some little differences between events, and I think these are really important to consider. Just thinking about what might be different in a Hikurangi subduction zone earthquake and tsunami. So for example, for COVID-19, we were asking people to sort of physically isolate, sort of stay in their homes, to don't go out, you know, don't talk to other people, don't see other people. Whereas a lot of our resilience research says that, you know, social networks are important, being together is important. So there are some kind of little differences there in kind of how we manage the different events. Although in saying that, there will be definitely pockets places that will be quite isolated in a big earthquake and tsunami. We're asking people for COVID to stay in your place, shelter in place, rather than evacuate. For other events, there'll be evacuations. There might be some slight differences in some of the survival items you might need to put together, or some of the structural mitigation that you might need to do. So for example, I talked a bit about you know, pinning your bookcases back against the wall for an earthquake itself. And COVID-19 was, I sort of call it more of a slow onset event rather than a rapid event. So in the weeks leading up to level 4 being announced, people could kind of see that something was happening, something was changing. And so they were able to start sort of preparing, going to the supermarket, getting some extra items before they had to lock down. Whereas in an earthquake and tsunami event, you don't have that opportunity to do those things beforehand. So you need to be already prepared with those things. It happens very quickly. The last thing I wanted to say there was really about the potential for thinking the next event will be the same. So as human beings, we often just draw on our experiences and we think that what we've experienced previously will be exactly the same in the future. So it'll roll out kind of as it rolls out in the future. So pandemics weighing very heavily on our minds at the moment, and we might be thinking about kind of the next pandemic and how we might need to prepare for that, but we might be perhaps not so focused on an earthquake or a tsunami or a volcanic eruption. So it's important to kind of think beyond what you're experiencing now into the kind of the what ifs of what might happen for other events. We also have there's also a temptation for us to be overly optimistic in that I survived this event, I was okay, you know, it's not going to be so bad next time. But it's important to think, well, it may not be quite the same. There might be still some extra things I need to do. So kind of putting a lid on the optimism a little bit, I suppose, and just thinking about maybe some of the other impacts there might be. And then there are some challenges of how we respond to an event in a COVID-19 context. So at the moment, we're obviously thinking about things like trying to distance ourselves from other people and use hand sanitizer, and there's a whole lot of I guess ways we're kind of living now that are not necessarily well, we might need to kind of think about how we do those, I suppose, if you have a big earthquake or a big tsunami event. So for example, I mean, if you're on the coast and you felt a long, strong earthquake right now, you'd probably prioritize your response to evacuating immediately rather than thinking about COVID-19. So how do we kind of prioritize our response to some of these things that are perhaps more dangerous in the initial stages? And then there's other issues like what does physical distancing look like when you're trying to evacuate, or if you're sheltering in place. So there are some definite, I guess, there's definite COVID context to some of this, but I guess the most important thing to think about is, you know, what do you need to do to keep yourself safe immediately? So I'm going to hand over to David now, who's going to talk a little bit about recovery and COVID-19 and kind of how recovery kind of might be transferable or not across different disasters.
Thank you, Julia. And I have to ask Julia to change the slide, so we'll stay with this one for a moment. Really, what we've all seen is that there is a new normal. We're all operating in new ways and new times. And one of really the challenges on recovery is people on one hand want to return to how things were, but things happen and the world will never be the same again. So often it's a time to reflect on what of the past we want to recreate, but what of the past maybe we want to leave behind. So the recovery from any disaster does give us choices and challenges. And as a researcher, we've looked at a lot of recoveries from a number of events to see what are the key elements that lead to successful recoveries. And this is very much playing out now in a COVID context. Next slide, Julia. So what I'm also interested in is both not only the physical impacts, and interesting with this virus, that we're not seeing the destruction. So that photo on the left is damage from the Canterbury earthquakes, and there was a lot of physical damage. So some hazards, floods, tsunamis, earthquakes will damage things, whereas this COVID, this pandemic, is not actually damaging things physically, but is impacting on people and both our social and sort of psychosocial well-being. And that's not just about the fear of it, and that fear obviously, as New Zealand was able to eliminate or reduce the risk from COVID by our isolation, but now playing out as the impacts of that event on society. And so it's really a social and economic issue we're dealing with. Next slide, Julia. So really what I want to do is just go over some core lessons that we've learned from research, and this is global research around, and asking the question, what are the core principles that do lead to effective recovery and the processes for recovery? So these 6 points here are our observations and our research from many decades globally about what leads to good recovery outcomes and also what challenges those good outcomes. So much of this in the New Zealand experience has come from obviously a lot of weather events, droughts of recent times, but also the Canterbury earthquake, where we had a number of these issues play. But from our research, both in New Zealand and overseas, there are some principles, and I'll just speak to these. So recovery is usually and needs to be based within the community that's impacted. They are the ones who understand the impacts. Yes, the central government or regional parts of the system or agencies, NGOs have a part to play. But for most people, a successful and effective recovery is community-based and involves the community that are impacted. So we see many of the challenges around both and the role of the state in recovery and the challenges between that community-led approach to central government dictated approaches. And we know that the more the community can share and be part of the recovery effort, usually the better outcomes that happen. What we also see in a recovery phase is that new things need to be done. Things need to be done in different ways, and it's often challenging for coordination and integration. And we really see in global research on recovery and in New Zealand, really the principle about leadership. Leadership not only at central level, so we've had leadership from our Prime Minister, our government departments, but leadership at all levels, so community leadership. And leadership can help give that coordination and integration that's really important for a successful recovery. But in recovery, often we're dealing with demand that exceeds supply. So there isn't enough to go round, or people want things in different orders. So it is highly contested recovery. What is important? And it's often driven by values as well. Some people, in the Canterbury earthquake example, they wanted that building repaired. Other people wanted that building replaced for something else. So it's often contested, and really important to have fair for social justice, for democracy, mechanisms for mediation. How do you reconcile those contested needs? What is more important? Because the impacted person or group, their needs are important to them, but other groups have other needs. So you need processes, and we need them in everyday non-disaster times as well. But how do you mediate those contested, and who decides what priorities things are done? So you do need to think about that mediation process. What we also see in disasters is in the recovery is that most people involved have not been through these events before. So for all of us in New Zealand, this is a new experience. So we don't have often the skill sets and knowledge to deal with these new times. So whether you are sort of a leader, a CEO, or down at the community, there is need to learn new skills to operate in these new times. So really important training, professional development, and support to give communities, individuals, organizations the skills they need for these new times. And we need to invest in that to build the skill set for the times at hand. Flexibility is a key thing, because often as we were going through the start of the COVID, the levels rising up, the future was uncertain. So we need to change systems. And one of the things we have seen is the ability for a number of agencies, communities to be flexible, to meet the emerging problems as they unfold, because often they're unpredictable, they're unknown, because we don't know what to do. So really important to have flexibility at all levels, from your household to your workplaces to society as a whole to address these new and emerging problems. Many of them we don't have the agency's support or history to manage them effectively because they are new. So we need to repurpose many of the things we do. So flexibility is a key. And the last one is really about sharing information. And anyone in emergency management knows often we are trying to make decisions with imperfect information. It is hard always to know when things are rapidly evolving in new ways, what is happening. So it's really important that information about what is happening, about what other agencies, what individuals, what communities are doing, is that we share this information. Often during non-disaster times, a lot of information is perceived to be commercially sensitive, or we can't share it, but there is also in sharing information a contest here, because a lot of information is personal, private information, and we have issues around privacy and the rights of individuals. So at one hand, we have an urgent need for sharing information, but we also have a need to protect that information too, because not all information it should or could be or can be shared. So we have to manage that really contested space around information sharing. Who sees it, for what purpose, and why, and what safeguards do we have for our members of our community in this space? So those are really just 6 high-level things that we have known from a lot of research globally over the last century that really help drive effective community recovery. And I think they are playing out now in the COVID situation, but they're definitely things we need to bring into the planning for response to events at the Hikurangi margin, because many of these attributes for recovery hold true, whether it's from a pandemic, a drought, a flood, an earthquake. And it's really how society organizes these recovery periods, which are for most people new experiences. They're difficult, high demand, high need, and the well-being of people needs to be at the center of that. So there are things we can do to pre-plan for a recovery for events that we haven't faced yet. But I think we need to understand the core principles, and these are some of them. But how we do it is also a challenge. So that is one of the things we're facing at the moment. Next slide. I think it's a thank you one button. Thank you. So anyway, that's really just some high-level views on recovery. And I think we are living that now, but we can equally transfer some of this knowledge and experience to preparing for events that will occur in the future in a different context. So I'll hand over to Natasha, I think. Who's on mute? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, David. Awesome. All right. Well, I guess I'll just quickly wrap up before we go into question time. Oh, I'm in the dark. So I think my sensor's gone off in my room. I'll keep going forward. So to wrap up, I guess 4 weeks, we've looked at a variety of subjects, and we've taken a bit of a journey together, looking at the current, thanks Kate, current science on the subduction zone. Then we've had a look at the scenario of a large Hikurangi earthquake and tsunami. We've moved to look at the impacts, and tonight we've talked a little bit more around preparedness and what that means and what we can all do. So I guess I just want to finish up by really asking, what's your plan? Do you have a plan? And if you don't, that's okay, because there's very simple steps that we can all take to make sure we do have a plan. And I want to start off by saying as well that I know it can seem really overwhelming. We've covered a lot of subjects in the last 4 weeks, and there's a lot of information out there, but we can break it down into a couple key things that we can do. So starting with what we can do before an event. So what can we do? We can look to fix, fasten and forget the items in our households. We can make grab bags to make sure that we're prepared wherever we are, if an emergency occurs and we're at work, at home, or even if we're out and about. We can store emergency supplies at our home, as we've talked about, and we can also talk with our family, what our family plan is, what our household plan is, where we're going to evacuate to, and how are we going to know to reach each other in an emergency. When we move to the response, so how are we going to respond to an event? There's also a few things we can do here to get more prepared. That includes participating in the annual shakeout drill, so practicing our drop, cover, hold. And it's important to know that you don't have to wait for once a year. You can do this at any time. You can practice it with your family. give it a go. And we can also participate in the annual Tsunami Hikurangi Week. Again, feel free to do this anytime. You can go for a walk with your family to practice your evacuation route. Make it part of your daily routine. And then in terms of recovery as well, we can think about how we'll recover from an event. And to be honest, a lot of the stuff we do as part of preparedness will help us recover a lot easier. But if you're, say, a business, thinking about business continuity planning, for example, can help us pre-think around what we might need to do in an event to get our business up and running as soon as possible. So I'll leave those tips with you, but that is a lot. So feel free to visit getready.gov.nz to find out more. And for now, I'll hand you back to Ben, who's going to field your questions.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Natasha. First of all, thanks to the three speakers for such a thorough overview. I found this presentation really fascinating, especially when Julia got on to talking about that whole idea of concurrent hazards and the fact that it would have been pretty horrific if COVID had going on and we had had a major earthquake or something along those lines. And it really kind of highlighted the fact that as communities, we have to be quite nimble, quite agile to be able to be prepared to face these really quite different hazards head on. I've got a few questions coming in from the audience, which is great. We are going to have a draw for the grab bag tonight. And so, yeah, if you've got any other questions as we go through these, please pipe up on the chat line. Firstly, I really like this question, Natasha. It probably touches on what you asked last. What you sort of covered last, but a lot of the focus in COVID-19 has been on business closures and economic decline and that sort of thing. What can business owners do in terms of preparing and preparedness for recovery?
Cool. Yeah, great question. So as you said, yeah, I did slightly touch on it on my last point there. There is actually specific guidance online for business owners to have a look at. And so that is on that getready.gov.nz website. And that will give you templates, tips and tricks and things to think about when you're preparing a business for an emergency. And from small businesses to large businesses, it's important that we all do business continuity planning. Because as you say in the question, it helps us get back on track as soon as possible. So I'd really encourage you to check out the website and use those resources there.
That's great. I guess the second question is kind of related to this idea of preparedness as well, in the sense that we hear a lot of these kind of one-liners from agencies and that sort of thing about simple things we can do. In actual sort of practice, there are complexities. And this person asks, how best can we prepare our young children for an event like this? We're not just preparing ourselves, we're preparing our families, we're preparing our loved ones. So maybe Julia or David or Natasha, you have some comments on that.
Yeah, I'll start and Julia can finish. I mean, one of the challenges, and we have lots of questions for adults about how do you talk to children about disasters, and there's actually some guides around it because they are naturally scary things. But I think what we find in the research is quite clear that actually appropriate engagement with children about these events actually reduces anxiety in them. So we see that schools are key parts of this, and they've adopted a number of strategies to deal with them. But I think it's really important with families and schools is that it becomes a community conversation, not just one between the teachers and the children, that really the whole households need to be part of that as well to understand it. But children themselves are more anxious if they don't understand hazards than if you talk to them about, and there are some tips about how to do it. So it's really addressing the things that we can do to protect ourselves, reassuring them that as adults we're aware of these and there are measures in place, and really help them understand that yes, they are scary things, but there are things you can do about it.
Are there practical things, just to follow up on that question? I mean, Julia, you have young kids as well, and I know you live in the Hutt Valley, but work in Wellington. Are there practical steps that you've taken to understand, so your kids understand what to do in an event like this?
I think David gave a pretty good summary of some of the key things to do. I mean, I think if you want to ask me from a kind of a personal perspective, I think some of also the emergency planning that you do with your children so that they know what might happen and how they might need to deal with it is really important. And, you know, for me, my children are in Upper Hutt and I work in Wellington City, and so we have arrangements on who is going to look after those children or pick up those children, and the children know who that is. They know they practice the drills at school, so they practice the drop, cover and hold, or the turtle as they call it in schools, and so they do some of those. They're involved in the planning process and also in practicing those drills.
And I'll just add as well, there's some resources out there that you can search for directly too, such as What's the Plan Stan, which is geared up for children, and also Te Hikoi Aruamoko. So Aruamoko's Walk, and that's a book for children around hazards. So there's lots of stuff online there. Just have a Google and I think there'll be lots that comes up.
Yeah, that's great. There are a lot of resources. This is another question around sort of personal resilience, and I guess it ties in somewhat with your discussion around beliefs, Julia. And the question is, how do we best feel safe in our preparedness for these events?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because we did some work recently looking at apartment dwellers who lived through the Kaikoura earthquake in 2016. And one of the key things that came up was really around their feelings of safety. So the reasons why they evacuated their apartment buildings after the shaking was because they felt unsafe. And the reason they chose to return was when they felt safer. So feelings of safety, I think, are really an important part of the process. So I think in terms of personal resources or personal beliefs, I think it's really working with people to help them understand, as I was saying before, that preparedness can make a difference to your outcome. And by doing some of those practical things, that is actually going to help you respond to an event and help you recover in the long term. And also building up that kind of belief that, you know, I can do it, I can prepare, and I know how to respond, and that helps with, I guess, people's feelings of safety and people's feelings that they're in control, as opposed to they're not in control for an event like that.
Yeah, good answer. Linked back to kids again, and I guess in terms of empowering that whole message around getting prepared and that sort of thing. Are our schools teaching our children if this happened during school hours? So is there initiatives within the schools that are kind of, you know, educating kids on what to do if this happens? Yeah,
so I think schools do emergency planning. They have plans in place. But I think what's most important there is that parents are aware of what those plans are and make a concerted effort to talk to the school around what the plan is in an emergency, and that way everybody's on the same page when something happens. So I'd really encourage you to get in contact with your school and have a chat to them about what their plan is.
Cool. I'm going to wrap this up. I guess the next few questions that have come in are sort of around the kind of scale of the Hikurangi event. And I guess there is a sort of emphasis on the preparedness messaging that the three of you are getting across around that whole idea of self-resilience, because the huge scale of an event like the Hikurangi, an event on the Hikurangi subduction zone, is a little bit different to what we've seen in Kaikoura and Christchurch and that sort of thing in terms of the widespread effects of the event. So I've got this first question that is, in the Wairarapa, how long shall we be self-sufficient for?
I can probably take that one again. General advice is it's good to have at least 3 days of water supply, and that's 3 litres per day per person. and that doesn't include pets or for washing or whatnot, and to have long-lasting food and buckets and gloves and whatnot as part of your emergency supplies. You can find out more on getready.govt.nz as well around that. But I think what I would say is, if you think you're going to be in an area that might be isolated, to really think about if you could put a few more supplies in your pack. And that could be because you've been isolated before, or maybe you might live in some steep terrain and there could be landslides potentially if there's an earthquake. So you think it's likely that it could be a little bit longer. So if you're unsure though, I would encourage you to talk to your local civil defence group, and they'll be able to give you some more specific advice for your area.
I can also say that the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Group also talk about doing it for a bit longer as well. So they say just think about it for 7 days as well. So support what Natasha's saying there in terms of like have a think about it, and if you think it's going to be longer, maybe err on the side of having items for a longer period of time.
I guess it ties in with sort of evacuees study, and also something you touched on earlier, Julia, around the fact that some of the members of our community are a little bit more vulnerable in terms of other people don't have a huge amount of money or resources. For some people, it's difficult to put food on the table that week, let alone having a stockpile of food for a week just in case it happens. What would you suggest there? Are there ways that the community can pull together?
I'll just reflect on events that have occurred before. So often it's really around the collective preparedness of communities. So we've seen this in COVID, how communities come together and support. And we've seen that in many communities in disasters where the most vulnerable are supported by the less vulnerable, so they work together. So the vulnerability of a community is as good as the collective effort, and we've seen many cases. So not all members of the community individually can prepare, but it's really important that the collective responsibility and the communities look after themselves. So that this individualist is really, in many communities, is a foreign construct. We are much more collective society, and collective societies do better. So it is looking out for those around you, especially even in evacuation. There were many heartwarming stories of during the Kaikoura evacuation in Wellington and Eastbourne, where neighbours who didn't know each other that well assisted others and collectively woke them up, helped them move out as they were evacuating. So having that collective culture, and especially rapid onset events, will assist those who may need help, and often they may not have asked for it ahead of time, but it's knowing your community and supporting those around you. So as has been said, be kind to those around you, and that should also occur in the preparedness and response as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice summary, David. I guess just harking back, we've got another question around the guidelines for food and supplies, and it relates particularly to rural communities. And is the guideline for food for 3 days still advisable, or should people living in rural communities have more supplies? I wonder if maybe they would have more supplies anyway, and generally rural communities have large, freezers and that sort of thing, but you might have a different take on that from your research, Natasha or Julia.
I think you're probably quite well placed to answer that one, Ben, given that you've got experience of rural living.
Being a country bumpkin.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Rural lifestyles compared to urban lifestyles are different, and there are probably lots of ways that rural people are more resilient because they might have greater stockpiles of things because they less frequently go into town or go and get supplies. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's identifying your own unique context, your own unique circumstance. If you live in a rural area, you might have other challenges, such as, being cut off from other people, not being able to see other people, just because of the things that happen in an earthquake, whether it's, landslides or your roads not working, those types of things. So it's trying to think of what's going to matter in your context, and then how you might need to prepare for it, personalizing it to yourself, really.
So you might have more supplies, but you also might need those supplies because you might be isolated for a bit longer or what have you. Yeah, cool.
Yep, absolutely, yeah.
So just one final question, and I kind of chuckled a bit, Julia, because we vetted a picture out of your slideshow, which was definitely along these lines. The question is an 85-meter high tsunami realistic in New Zealand?
I have to admit, I saw that question and I clicked on the New Zealand Herald link to have a look at that. That's a really interesting question. And I think from what I read that tsunami was caused by the collapse of a volcano flank into the ocean. So if we're talking about a Hikurangi earthquake and tsunami, they are very different sources. But what's most important, I think, to remember is that when we have events that happen really quickly, it's important to rely on the natural warning signs. So that's if it's long, so longer than a minute in terms of an earthquake, or strong, hard to stand up, then you need to evacuate immediately to higher ground or inland, and wait until you receive advice that you've got the all clear. And that's kind of what I'd say for that, because unfortunately I'm not a specialist in that area, but I don't know if Julia wants to add anything further there.
I just think we should bring back either Caroline or William.
Yeah.
I think they can answer that one.
Cool. So I guess that's all we have time for this evening. It was a really great final talk. I think it's very cool to sort of seen how this talk series has started with the science, and it's moved on through that process and how it becomes applied into social preparedness, and how we learn to be self-resilient, self-reliant, and focus on those sort of ideas of local resilience that are going to get us through a response and into a recovery when this event happens. Thanks very much, Julia, Natasha, and David, for concluding the series. If you have some questions, feel free to keep posting them on the East Coast Lab Facebook page, and we'll be able to get back to you if anything comes to mind in the next wee while. Keep engaging with our social media. So for example, if you want to learn more, visit the East Coast Lab YouTube page. There's some really interesting resources around the scenario, around the science that's happening, and also the preparedness and what you can do in terms of are you prepared at work? Is your business prepared? Are you prepared at home? Are your children prepared? There's some complexities to it, but and it all can seem quite overwhelming, but actually there's a lot of small practical things that we can do to ensure that we're better off in the long run. And overall, I think we've learned what we can do and what we can achieve if we pull together as a community and as a broader country. So thanks again for coming along. Stay safe out there, help each other, and haere rā. Thanks from the East Coast Lab team.